Hi Year 10. It's been a few weeks since we've been together in school, so I just wanted to say hi to you all, and I wanted to talk to you about what we've been doing in terms of the poetry anthology, why we've been doing it, and what I need you to be doing to get ready for next year. So before we left school, I talked to you about where we were up to with your English Literature GCSE. And you can see that we actually finished in a really strong position because we've completed 3 of the 5 texts and we are working away on the 4th one. I have to say how impressed I've been by the work you've been submitting to me. Just to jog your memories, we started off the year looking at Macbeth, which you also read in Year 9. We then read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I know that we need to revise that one a little bit, and that's something you might want to be doing at home. But we have completed the book, and you do know more than you think. We then read An Inspector Calls after Christmas, which we were really strong on, and over the last few weeks you've been working on the Power and Conflict anthology, and I've been really, really impressed by the standard of work, which I'm going to show you some now because it's been so good. So before we finish, I gave you this anthology book, which has got all the poems that you need in it. Now, if you have lost that for whatever reason, I've also included a link to a PDF version of that on every single lesson. So you can be printing off the poem that you need for each lesson. Remember, at the start it tells you which one you need to be looking at. Or if you prefer, you can just print them all off in one go and then be working through them one by one. So that's the main resource you need for this. It's not a book like the other texts. It's a collection of poems that the exam board has put together. And it's the Power and Conflict section that we are working on. And what I've been asking you to do each lesson is I've given you a poem to look at, and I've been giving you some notes on that poem. I've been giving you a PowerPoint which talks through some important points of it. I've also been including a link to Mr. Buss videos. And I said to you before, there are other resources out there. There's some really good videos on GCSE Pod. There's websites like BBC Bitesize you can be using, or Spark Notes. You all work differently, and that's great. So find something that works for you. But this is what I'm looking for. These are really fantastic notes here. You need to be transferring those ideas that you're picking up onto the poem. So you're picking out the key points. And the reason I wanted to show you this version is just the level of detail in these notes. I really like the way that it's zooming in on short phrases and key words. That's important. There's no point highlighting the whole thing. You need to be selective in what you're picking out. It's also got some terminology in there to think about the language and structural features for the AO2 marks, but more importantly, when it has picked out a feature, it's actually explaining the effect that feature creates. So for example, here where they picked out the oxymoron, it then said that that hints at the guilt that they feel. So this is what I want your anthologies to be looking like. One poem per lesson, adding as much detail as you can. Remember, the more work you do now, the more it will benefit you in the long run. The second part of each lesson is then summarising what you've learned into the knowledge organiser. There's 2 versions here. The version that I've saved onto every lesson is this paper version, which this person's copied out and then made notes under each of the headings, which is fantastic. It's really important that as well as having the language feature, there's a short quotation, because remember, just naming speeches doesn't mean anything. You need to say where is it used and why. So again, good terminology here, but more importantly, explaining the effect. This knowledge organiser is really important because it summarises it in your own words, and that's important for your understanding, because just copying notes onto the poem doesn't necessarily mean you're thinking about it. This makes you think about what are the important points that I actually need to remember for the exam. Another way of doing it, rather than printing off the paper version, is to just use the headings to write it yourself. So here we've got the headings transferred into Word, and this person's made some fantastic notes here. Really perceptive points about the effect of the language. I was very, very impressed by the level of detail here. And like I said it before, I'll say it again, I've been so impressed by the work that you're doing on these poems. So that's what I want to see from you, the anthology annotations, but also the summary notes in the knowledge organiser. And 1 for each poem. There's 15 poems to learn, and we're past halfway already, so we're doing fantastic with it. So what we need to think about now is, where is all this working towards? What is the end result of learning these 15 poems? So in the exam, you will have 1 question on the poems, the Power and Conflict anthology, and it's a 45-minute essay question, just like your other literature questions. And the first thing that they will be given in the exam is a list of the poems and people who have written them. So here they are, all 15 poems in the same order as they are in the anthology, next to the writers, the authors. After that, you will then be given one of the poems. In this case, it's Bayonet Charge. And the question even guides you a little bit to think about the effects of war. So you have to write about that named poem. That's not a negotiable. In this exam, you would have to write about Bayonet Charge or whatever a poem is named. And there's 15 poems, so any one of them could be that named poem. To help you with that, it is printed in the exam. So you've got that first one. And if I was taking this exam, my first step would be to be annotating the keywords and phrases to start planning my essay answer. However, that's not it. This is a comparison question. That's the command verb at the start. You have to compare it to another poem. Now, you can choose any of the other poems to compare it to. You've got a choice of 14. However, you do not have the rest of the anthology in the exam. All you've got is the list on the previous page. So you're going to have to write about the second poem which you've chosen from memory. There are no right or wrong answers here. You can make them link to any of the other poems. Obviously, some go better together than others, and some will make stronger comparisons. But you've got to have that second poem remembered for the exam. So it's important, go back to that knowledge organiser, that we are learning short, easy to remember quotations that we can use in this exam. We also need to start thinking about how the poems compare. So that's what the exam question is going to look like. You have to write about 2 poems. One is named and printed in the exam paper. That's the one you have to write about. The other one you can choose, but you've got to write about it from memory. Just like all the literature questions, the assessment objectives stay the same. Assessment objective 1 is the writer's ideas. What is the poem about? Now we know they're about power and conflict because that's the title of the anthology. So what power struggle or what conflict is present in the poem? Importantly is AO2. How is the poem written? This is asking you to think about the writer's choice of language. So that could be the words that they've chosen, analysing the vocabulary choices. It could be looking at specific techniques they've used. It can also be the structure, because the structure of a poem is really important. So things like, does it rhyme? Is it regular or irregular? Has it got any enjambment in it? Or is there punctuation, middle of lines and caesuras? Those kind of features are important for thinking about how the writer's creating their effect. And then finally, the really important one that we often forget about, the context. Why has the poem been written? A lot of the context poems are inspired by real historical events like World War I and World War II. There were some 19th century ones which reflect older conflicts. There's a lot of modern poems that reflect our modern ideas of war. Although it might not be as big as World War I or II, there's a lot of wars going on which have inspired the writers. So think about the historical context. What has happened in the world that's inspired the writer? And more importantly, what's the writer trying to say about that conflict? What's his message to us? These objectives have been the same on every single literature question, so you should be getting quite familiar with them now. But it's important that in your exams, you make sure that you are covering all 3 points. What is the poem about? How is it written? And why? As we're getting through the anthology, and as I said, we're past halfway now, we also need to think about the second part of that question. You're going to have to make a comparison. So while you're reading a poem, think about which poem would I compare this to? Which poem is it similar to, and which poem is it different to? And the best comparisons have got a point of similarity, but also a subtle difference. And often that difference can be linked to the context because they're written in slightly different time periods or inspired by a different life experience. So what we're going to look at in the rest of this lesson is starting to categorise the poems to help you make those comparisons. And we're going to do that by creating a mind map together. Now, I created my mind map using an online mind map creator. I just Googled that and I found a free website. It's okay, and I think some of you will like doing it that way, but I personally would rather do it on paper. So the other way is to get yourself a big piece of paper. A3 works best if you have it. Give yourself lots of space because you're going to want to keep these notes neat because they're going to help you with your revision. Any mind map begins with a big idea. And in this case, the big idea is power and conflict. The exam board's told us that. And that's important because these poems can be interpreted in different ways. but the exam board, through the title of the anthology, is guiding you to think about power and conflict. So if we think about the poem Kamikaze, in many ways that's about her relationship with her father, so that could have been in the love and relationship section that we aren't doing. But the exam board have deliberately put it in the power and conflict section to guide you to think about the conflict that occurs within the poem. That's the big idea, and every poem is linked by that big idea of power and conflict that goes in the middle of your mind map. The next step then is to create subgroups, because power and conflict is a massive issue. So what you now need to do is start to think about the different types of conflict or power that exist in the poems. So I've given you a few different ideas here. Obviously, war and soldiers, that's the obvious form of conflict, but that only accounts for about a third of the poems. What other types of conflict are there? Conflict with nature, memories of conflict, all those kind of things. These are just some ideas that I've put down as my starting point. Can you think of any more to add to your mind map? Around that big idea of power and conflict, start to break it down to smaller subcategories. What types of conflict are there in the poem? There might be conflict within a family, that's not on there. What could you add to it? How would you group these poems together? That's step 2. Step 3 then is to look at the poems themselves and start to categorise them within those types of conflict. Now, this is allowing us to get ready for the question by thinking about which poems group together, because in that question on Bayonet Charge, which is about war and soldiers, it'd be easiest to compare it to another poem about war and soldiers. So that straight away is helping you to think about your comparison. However, some of these poems fall into more than one category, so think carefully about them. For example, Exposure is about war and soldiers because Wilfred Owen was a soldier during World War I. However, if we actually think about the poem, it's not really about his experience of being a soldier and fighting an enemy. It's more about a conflict with nature. That's the thing that's killing them in this poem. So it can also come into the category conflict with nature. So don't think that there's only one answer for each of the poems, but just go through the list at the front of the anthology or the start of the PowerPoint and just start to think about which category would I put them in. This is a good chance to use colour coding. Maybe give each category a colour so you can group them together and visually see how they link to each other. To go through all the poems we've read so far and add them onto this, and as we continue to work through the poems, you can build your mind map, and it's going to be a really useful revision tool for you. If you want to go even further on your mind map, you could then add brief notes. I'm just talking about 1 or 2 words here to answer the key questions linked to objectives. What is the poem about? What's the conflict? You might want to link on to, Exposure about World War I. Kamikaze is about a suicide mission that doesn't happen. Just those key words to guide you. Maybe thinking if there's anything important about how it's written. Maybe a repetition, a line that comes back again and again, like in the Emigre. That's an important technique. Or even the context. That's really important. You're learning that. So learning that there are several poems about war and soldiers, but they do link to different wars that have happened throughout history. Those extra notes just give you a bit more guidance to help you thinking about your comparisons. So what I'm asking you to do today, Year 10, is to complete this mind map, starting with the big idea in the middle, where you think about the power and the conflict, and then breaking it down to smaller categories, and then fitting the poems into those categories. I suggest that you go through this step by step. The PowerPoint is also going to be saved on Show My Homework if you prefer to use it that way. And then remember to send me your completed mind map so I can see what you've been doing. You're doing really well, Year 10. I'm so proud of all the work that you've handed in, and it is going to pay off next year. Let's keep going and let's keep doing the work to get ready for that exam.